Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks to all of you for joining, and thanks to the other panelists. It's really great to be here together, and we're really excited to be doing this webinar. So we launched this campaign, Justice Beyond Jails, in March at the side of the UN Commission on the Status of Women. And the point of the campaign is that it's a global feminist campaign that challenges our reliance, or in fact, our over reliance on policing, prosecutions, and prisons to address gender-based violence, and to really spotlight, because I think there are many, many ways that feminist groups, community groups engage in grappling with gender-based violence, responding to gender-based violence without engaging with criminal legal systems. But we often don't hear about that. So the point of the campaign is really two-pronged. The first is to prompt questions about why are we relying on policing and prisons in the context of gender-based violence, when over and over what we hear from GBV practitioners is that's not working. Um, and why aren't we spotlighting the kind of amazing alternatives that exist? And that's not to say there's no information about it, but I think as a feminist, anti-GBV movement, human rights movement, and allied movements, we often pay much more attention to making criminal legal systems work for us rather than looking at what's wrong with them. And we focus here on gender-based violence. As the Just Futures Collaborative, we look at all forms of criminalization and seek to build bridges across movements that are challenging criminalization or who are on the receiving end of criminalization. One could say that's all of us. But um, and you all here today are the folks we see ourselves in conversation with. We're not necessarily trying to reach general audiences, but have a conversation within our own movements about the ways in which we rely on criminal legal systems, even when we know not only do they not work, but in many cases, and we certainly see this everywhere around us, those systems are being used to criminalize us, to stop our activism, to stop our speaking out, to stop our defending land, to stop, to stop our journalism. So we see the ways in which the criminal legal system coincides very easily with anti-gender and anti-democracy movements in a particularly toxic mix at this moment. Going back to GBV in particular, what we see, and the research is pretty convincing about this, but we also spent a lot of time as we were developing the campaign talking to GBV practitioners and heard this over and over again. First of all, most people who experience gender-based violence don't look for help from anyone. When they do look for help, it's the unusual case that they will actually engage with the criminal legal system, or go to the police station to make a complaint, for instance, or go to a hospital and agree there to have the police engage in the process. So first of all, it just isn't what most people do. And when they do, it causes more harm than good in many different ways. And so we list here, it can be re-traumatizing, and that's, either outright humiliation by members of the criminal legal system who don't believe you, or say you asked for it, or say you deserved it because your clothes weren't right, or your dress was too short, or you're a sex worker, you're a drug user, etc. So all the ways that re-traumatization occurs through through humiliation or through forcing forcing you to speak publicly about your experience. We also see criminalization of survivors. And this is an unfortunately all too common experience, especially um, in jurisdictions that have mandatory arrest policies. And too often what happens is the police show up as the person who has been on the receiving end of gender-based violence is taking a step to protect themselves, and they are then arrested as the perpetrator, and that happens over and over. Um, there's underprotection by design of particular communities, communities who are already marginalized. um, when they try to make a case, have that dismissed very quickly. There's also false accountability, and that's using power and privilege to ensure impunity on the one hand and false accusations on the other. So the system gets manipulated in ways that preserve existing axes of discrimination and existing forms of power and privilege. It's also used as a way to shrink state support. So the state can say, we are making these laws harsher and we're going after criminals, when in fact that's an excuse for not providing funds for the social services, health services, etc., that folks really need and could really make a dent in addressing gender-based violence. And then finally, there's misuse of criminalization. And again, that relates to some of what I've said already, but the ways in which particular communities are criminalized, LGBT folks, sex workers, the criminalization of abortion, etc., that then get mapped onto what's already not working with the criminal legal system vis-a-vis gender-based violence. We can go to the next slide. So, so what do punitive approaches actually produce? And I've said some of this already. They punish people who are already marginalized, sex workers, migrants, people in poverty face prosecution while powerful escape accountability. In the US, Black women are incarcerated at 1.6 times the rate of white women, for instance. And I should say along those lines that the rates of globally, the rates of women being imprisoned is rising tremendously and disproportionately. So there are a number of different factors that are happening that that really exacerbate each other. Often these approaches control survivors, they don't protect them. Um, they strip agency from people who have been harmed. So you go and you make a complaint because what you want is the violence to stop, but you realize once you've done that, that you've become embroiled in a process that isn't really the process that you wanted. You don't necessarily want your perpetrator to be in prison because maybe they're one of the main breadwinners in your family. And if they're in prison, then, it may be that the violence stops, at least for the time that they're in prison. But it doesn't help with your own survival, your family's survival, and it doesn't really help the community either. It also fuels dangerous agendas. We see right now the ways that anti-gender groups are weaponizing gender-based violence narratives. We see that particularly in the case of the Israel Palestine, or the destruction of Gaza, and the ways in which gender-based violence has been used as an excuse for that destruction. These punitive approaches fail. They simply don't work, and they often make things worse. Most survivors don't want to engage in that system, but they want help. They want intervention. They want the violence to stop. They want their families to be safe. They want accountability. But the criminal legal system really isn't working for them. And then finally, what punitive approaches do is they extract the individual experience out of its context. And so gender-based violence isn't a series of individual crimes. It's a socio-political crisis that requires a response that happens at that same level. You can go to the next slide, please. So what we've done for our campaign, Justice Beyond Jails, is try to make all of this more visible. And we're doing that in a number of ways. We have social media campaign. We've got a number of publications. And as our colleagues here are also doing, and you know what, I'm sorry, I should have said at the outset that it's really nice to be here with this group because we are the co-collaborators in this campaign. And so it's really wonderful to be part of a conversation with all of you. I know that Raisa will introduce you, but I wanted to also say my thanks and appreciation for being here with you. One of the things that we've done for the campaign is we've created an interactive storytelling tool. And the point of this tool is that it really takes you inside the experience of these composite characters that we've created. They are fictional characters, but they're based on real stories. And they're actually, in most cases, specifically based on real stories. And they bring you into the really difficult process of how you make choices around engaging with criminal legal systems when you've been harmed through gender-based violence. And we have 4 characters who are available now, and what you see in front of you is the new characters. There are 4 new stories. There are more than 4 characters, and we will be who will be available on June 1st. We will launch the next set of stories and characters. You can go to the next slide. So can you go back for 1 second? No, back to Kiri. Yeah, okay. So I wanted to just give you one very quick example of what happens in the story. So this character is named Kiri. She's a young Indigenous woman. She is married to a majority man. She when they met, they were very much in love. When he started doing things that caused her harm, she kind of excused them as his way of expressing his love for her. And I think that's a pretty common story. And the violence escalates, and at one point he is chasing her. She's terrified. She picks up a lamp and hits him with it. And he then calls the police. You can go to the next slide, please.
Susanna, we
Yes.
have about 30 seconds.
Okay. So she then, as you can see here, she has a set of impossible choices, and you in the tool engage as Kiri trying to figure out how do you navigate this very hostile system, which not only isn't protecting you and giving you safety, but it's now criminalizing you. You can go to the next slide. So in the end, what we want to say through this tool, but more importantly through the campaign with our collaborators here, is that justice is possible, but it's not about policing in prisons. It's about community safety. It's about restorative and transformative justice, survivor-centered human rights approaches, and really importantly, decriminalization and legal reform. You can go to the next slide. Over to you, Raisa. Raisa, we can't hear you.
The famous Zoom mute problems. I just wanted to say thank you so much, Susanna, for introducing some of the analysis that this campaign is rooted in. And that's where we start the webinar series from as well. So for the first webinar, as Susanna said earlier, we have all of the organizations collaborating to bring together the Justice Beyond Jails campaign. And we will be talking to them about their motivations behind engaging with and organizing this campaign. To quickly introduce our panel, first we have Mamello Sejake. She's the Communications and Advocacy Lead at Athena Network. From AWID, we have Jessica Whitbread. She's the Membership and Constituency Engagement Lead. From IPPF, we have Marevic Parcon. She's the Solidarity for Change and Voice Director. We also have Nadia Rasidi. She is the Feminist Research Lead at IWRAW Asia Pacific. And all of you already met Susanna Fried, who's a co-director at Just Futures Collaborator. Before we move on to the panel, I just wanted to give you a little bit more context for our discussion today. As feminist movement builders and gender justice activists, all of us have worked in some capacity on GBV response. And a core area of this work around the world sits within law and policy reform. This means that we have decades-long engagement with law behind us, and that has yielded some imperfect, incomplete public awareness and acknowledgement that many of the practices and interactions in our society should be accounted for as gender-based violence and hence should be unacceptable. However, the use of criminal law to curtail GBV or respond to GBV has always delivered lesser than desirable results, as you saw from Susanna's presentation earlier. Decades of feminist activism has seen all of us try to sort of fix these criminal laws and processes so that they serve justice for those who experience harm. And we've all engaged in a whole spectrum of processes trying to fix these laws. Now, those could be legal reform, it could be conducting capacity building for those within the system, it could be monitoring the system, it could be a series of documentation processes to fix the system. It could be trying to improve accessibility, trying to get the system to acknowledge an activity or an incident as valid gender-based violence. But we've engaged a whole lot in trying to calibrate criminal law so that it responds to the gender-based violence within our context. And that's where really this conversation today builds from. We want to start from this point of the work behind us to try and make criminal law work for us, but also the extensive evidence that exists that tells us that there are many flaws in that process. So given this context, my first question to our panelists today is, what is that piece of evidence or experience, or what was that turning point that has shaped your organization's thinking on carceral justice and GBV? And why does this campaign feel relevant right now? Maybe we can start with Jessica.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. So I don't know if we can pinpoint a time at AWID in our 40 plus year history where we shifted thinking on the carceral system and GBV. But over the years, AWID's noticed the gaps in mainstream feminism, feminist movements, and tried to pull feminists that organize on the margins to the center through our movement support work. We align with sex workers, trans folks, non-binary folks, feminists resisting the war on drugs, living with HIV, queer folks, and other folks who are criminalized, to make sure that they're incorporated in these broader discussions. And I think for us, one of the reasons that we did want to join the campaign was because criminalization, especially around GBV, exposes one of the feminist fault lines. GBV is It's a really tricky. It's really tricky in our movement. Of course, we don't want it. Of course, we want patriarchy to be smashed. We want it to end. We want equality, but it doesn't mean that we need to use prison systems in order to get there. So for us at AWID, the abolition of the prison industrial complex encompasses the abolishing criminalization, policing, surveillance, prisons, and other systems of punishment that have been entrenched in societies from legacies of enslavement and colonization. And we just know that from experience, lived experience of many of us and our members, that prison systems, they don't work. And as Susanna was saying, you pretty much gave all of the reasons that we joined. So I was like, check, check, check. But yeah, they don't work. And they don't work, especially for women and trans folks. We know that folks who are like they don't who are experienced GBV, they don't often go to the hospitals. They don't seek help from psychiatrists, social workers, and they definitely don't go to police, especially if they're criminalized, because right away the criminal system turns against them. So, for example, I can give, I have a long history in the HIV movement, and there's a very clear example of a precedent-setting case in Canada where a woman was had a partner, was abused for 4 years. At a certain point, when she did actually go to the police. Maybe I should start with she was living with HIV. They had this relationship at the 4 year mark. She was like, okay, enough is enough. She goes to the police. He is charged and convicted on the day of sentencing. The judge comes back and he says, due to extraordinary circumstances, he's not proceeding with criminal charges for him. And the court turns around and charges and convicts her with aggravated sexual assault for HIV non-disclosure, thereby erasing 4 years of abuse that she has faced. So that doesn't make sense. And this happens all the time to folks who are criminalized. So again, sex workers, folks who use drugs, um, trans people, whoever lives in a body that the courts deem criminal. So we joined this campaign because I think it helps to unearth um, some of these conversations and exposes places in the feminist movement where we need to do better and have some of those nuanced and difficult conversations. And we're really excited to have those with our members. So we're really looking forward to creating those spaces with you. And thanks a lot. I yield my time.
Thanks so much, Jessica. And thank you for bringing that point about feminist fault lines that this topic sort of falls under, and I'm hoping we can speak more about that as we go forward. I just also want to remind folks who are listening in that they can send in questions on the Q&A feature, so please do. With that, Bing, can I invite you to share your thoughts?
Thank you, Rajsa. Thank you, everyone. Good evening from Manila. So yes, IPPF is a proud partner of this initiative. And as you all know, we are a global federation and movement of 100 plus locally led member associations located in 150 countries globally. And I think it's safe to say also, tailing into what Jess has already mentioned, like the shift is not something like, yeah, today I'm going and, calling for justice, not jails, but beyond jails. But I think IPPF's perspective on carceral justice and GVB has been shaped by decades, over 70 years of service delivery experience. And that informs us that, that punitive system doesn't really work specifically for the most marginalized. We have been working alongside social movements and marginalized communities, and specifically those who are, excluded from health and social systems. What I can say though is that was there that shift in our trajectory and direction. There was so in I think 2023, IPPF embarked this journey with our come together strategy and made a decisive and courageous, kind of commitment to advance our mission to deliver quality people-centered care, where we intentionally partner with those who are most excluded. And we, IPPF, and brought together, established a cohort called Community Engagement and Partnership Lead Cohort within the Secretariat. So these cohort made up of dedicated advocates and activists, many of whom lived with lived experience and deeply rooted connections with marginalized communities and grassroots networks. And this also allows us to directly support our member associations, to collectively engage with formal collectives and informal networks of marginalized and criminalized communities to advance inclusive and transformative change. So which means that there was this strategy that guided us to look into deeply and working deeply with the communities. And together, yes, as I mentioned, with the cohort that we establish. And also, of course, re-emphasizing and highlighting the fact again and again that criminalization doesn't really work. And it did, far more harm than good. We know that they undermine health and safety. They restrict access. And we know as a service delivery organization, they restrict access to essential services like healthcare and harm reduction, and reinforce structural inequalities, including racism, patriarchy, homophobia, and economic disparity. This has been laid out to us earlier in the conversation. But specifically, I would really wanted to also look into the criminalization of sex work, drug use, abortion, and poverty-driven offenses. It hasn't really, led us to safer communities or better health. I'm from the Philippines. We have been criminalizing. There was this so-called war on drugs that killed over 20,000 people. Are we safe now? Can we say that? No. Instead, it perpetuates stigma. It pushes people further from support they need. And we've seen that over and over. Study shows, and a lot of evidence and research. Portugal is one of the case that we can highlight that decriminalization really work. And so why this campaign is important? It is really important because we really think that it is urgent. We have seen the evidence already, and obviously criminalization would keep us from, that would not keep our communities from safety and being healthy. We already know that. And but I think the effort of IPPF to bringing in the community engagement and partnership cohort is that because we in this campaign that we are also doing, we must also center the leadership and expertise of those impacted by criminalization, and also invest in community-led strategies to advance health, justice, and dignity for all. I think, yes, I would stop there, Isa.
Thank you so much, Bing. And thank you for especially pointing out how this affects poverty-driven offenses. I'm going to, I really do want to ask questions about that, but we'll come back. I'm going to move to Mamello.
Thank you and hi. So Athena Network's thinking on incarceration, justice, and gender-based violence has been shaped by years of working in service of and in partnership with adolescent girls, young women living with HIV, sex workers, queer and gender diverse people, and feminist movements across Africa. So through this work, we have consistently seen that criminalization and punitive systems often deepen harm rather than provide safety, healing, and justice, right? So survivors of violence frequently encounter stigma, discrimination, harassment, and even further violence when engaging with criminal legal systems, particularly where gender, sexuality, HIV status, abortion, migration, and sex work are criminalized. Our commitment to decolonial approaches has also deeply influenced our analysis in Athena's work on decolonizing healthcare systems. We advocate for community-led, rights-based, and care-centered approaches because we recognize that many institutional systems continue to reproduce colonial power through control, exclusion, and policing bodies. Applying a lens of decoloniality to GBV and carceral justice means acknowledging that many criminal legal systems across Africa have been inherited from colonial systems that relied on punishment, on surveillance, and regulation of sexuality and morality to maintain control. And these systems were designed to protect the most marginalized people. And a key lesson of decolonial work is that justice cannot only be punishment and safety cannot be built through incarceration alone. And decolonial feminist approaches ask us to center dignity, bodily autonomy, healing, community care, and accountability. And they challenge us to imagine systems rooted in humanity rather than control. And this is especially important because the communities most harmed by violence are often also the communities most harmed by policing and criminalization. And a major turning point for us has been witnessing the growing convergence of anti-rights mobilization, authoritarian politics, and carceral responses across the continent. Seeing calls for harsher laws and punitive responses presented as solutions to GBV and social instability. The root causes of violence, which are inequality, patriarchy, poverty, colonial legacies, and economic exclusion, remain unaddressed. At the same time, feminist and grassroots organizations across Africa continue to model transformative approaches grounded in solidarity, in mutual aid, in collective care, and community accountability. So this is why the Justice Beyond Jails campaign comes at a very critical moment when we're called to imagine and rethink. We're living through a moment of deep backlash against gender inequality, gender justice, body autonomy, and democratic freedoms globally and across Africa. And this campaign creates an important space to challenge dominant ideas and safety, dominant ideas around safety and justice, while also amplifying feminist, decolonial, and community-based alternatives, which are rooted in dignity, in healing, and accountability, and collective care. That's my portion.
Thank you so much, Mamello, and thank you for really rounding up well what our campaign thought process has been. And thank you so much. I'm going to move on to Nadia right now.
Thanks, Raisa. And thank you to Just Futures for creating the space and inviting IWRAW Asia Pacific to be part of it. IWRAW Asia Pacific is an international feminist organization that's based in Kuala Lumpur, and we work primarily with the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, to protect and advance women's rights across the Global South. So our perspective really is grounded in decades, almost over 3 decades now, of engagement with feminist movements, human rights defenders, and grassroots organizations that are navigating the multilateral system. And through our work using the CEDAW framework to engage with these movements, we've seen both the possibilities and limitations of predominant responses to GBV. The marginalized communities that we work with, which include Indigenous peoples, migrants, sex workers, LGBTQ communities, persons with disabilities, they often experience policing and incarceration as sources of violence rather than protection, obviously because state institutions that are themselves major perpetrators of violence, surveillance, and repression. So some considerations in the work that we do in international advocacy include the tension, really examining the tension that exists between demanding state action on GBV and recognizing how we, in our demands, may be contributing to reifying the harms of a carceral system, and how the tendency for punitive responses to become the default active response, how dangerous that is, because then states then fail to invest in prevention and structural change. And the risk becomes that punishment becomes a substitute for actual transformation. So a key kind of thinking around our work is that seeing that states often find punitive approaches politically easier than structural reform. Because, for example, if you're pushing for harsher sentencing and saying they're expanding criminal laws, you're expanding definitions of crime and criminality, this allows the governments to appear tough on GBV. Meanwhile, ask for deeper investment on healthcare, housing, education, social protections, they're all neglected because they require actual redistribution of power and resources. So we ask ourselves, what is our complicity in enabling states to do this in our name? Feminist movements have fought long and hard to establish that violence against women is a human rights violation, and states have obligations to address it, because historically they've been dismissed as private matters, right? And so through CEDAW advocacy and broader feminist organizing at the UN, criminal law reform has become a visible and measurable way for states to demonstrate compliance with these obligations. And this work is necessary in some contexts where impunity persists. But over time, understandably, feminist movements have been and continue to question this over-reliance or criminalization. And so this campaign really is an important platform for this persistent questioning. Some of the key concerns that we have when it comes to criminalization is, looking, as I've alluded to, states adopting laws without actually addressing structural inequality, the underfunding of survivor services while punitive systems get expanded, the use of women's protection narratives to justify increasing policing, securitization, and border controls. You also see governments very commonly weaponizing GBV laws selectively against marginalized groups. For example, if you look at the gender-neutral domestic violence law in Australia and how it's being used to criminalize and punish Indigenous and Aboriginal women who are themselves victims. You also have this issue of anti-rights actors increasingly using punitive logics and protection narratives to advance regressive agendas, right? If you look at how, for example, the guise of protecting cis women and girls to deny the personhood of trans people and encourage violence against them. So for our work, treaty body systems still matter very deeply. Organizations rely on them as some of the few mechanisms capable of pressuring governments. We saw the impact of this during the early days of COVID-19, where these constructive dialogues were suspended and governments became even less responsive to this. So then the question for us really is not about abandoning these multilateral spaces, but to figure out how we can engage them critically and how we shape our advocacy demands to go beyond punishment. I think I'm over time, so I'll just stop here.
No, I think you're perfectly on time, and thank you for raising the point of what does state-based obligations actually look like other than criminal responses. And some of the stories in our tool actually ask this question. Having said that, I will just move to Susanna right now.
Thanks, and thanks so much for the comments that have already been made. I think that they've brought up a kind of the richness of why we all see this conversation as so important. It is a feminist fault line. The laws are so often colonial legacies, and we see the ways in which the criminal legal system, in terms of GBV, but more generally, is increasingly serving authoritarian, anti-gender, and anti-democracy action. Whether that's by governments or whether that's by non-state actors who are increasingly capturing the support of government. So I thanks for I think the really rich and thoughtful comments on that. I can't really answer the question of why we joined this campaign, since we were the initiators of the campaign. But I do want to say, we saw this as important because, as I think Jessica said, it is a feminist fault line. And it's a feminist fault line that we need to bring to the surface. Um, and it is also a really important way for us to build cross-movement conversations, because I think, as Bing was talking about, the criminalized communities have always struggled, and we see in this moment globally, we're all struggling more. So the need for us to figure out how we come together in a consolidated way is ever more urgent. And I'm actually going to be very quick here. I just wanted to pick up on where Nadia left off and talking about this moment, the conversation about gender-based violence and the rapid destruction of the multilateral system. I mean, I think the conversation about how we as feminists engage in the discussion about multilateralism is a big and really important conversation. I think a rather urgent conversation. But I think specifically within the context of gender-based violence, there are really interesting spaces, multilateral spaces, in which gender-based violence is a core concern. And there is really an opportunity for us to figure out when and how we can engage in those spaces to broaden this conversation, to bring more people into the conversation, to bring more feminists, more human rights folks, more human rights defenders, et cetera, into this conversation about gender-based violence. Because, as you've all said, that the harsher and harsher laws aren't serving us. They're serving regressive initiatives. They are serving anti-gender, anti-democracy efforts. And it's a really important way for us to build that conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and thank you all of you for highlighting some of the important pieces that we're trying to bring up through this campaign. I want to move us from a conversation about why we're doing this to something slightly more hopeful, but about beyond jails, what exists out there. Some of the alternatives have been built because we had to, because the systems that exist don't serve many of the communities that we work with. Some of them have been very meaningfully built because we want justice systems that are not punishment, that are not about control. So I want to ask each of you, beyond these carceral systems, what are some of the initiatives that center accountability, that center safety and protection and justice, that give you hope? And in this moment, you think we should be investing in and supporting, instead of supporting more stronger and deeper laws and criminal laws, of course. This time, let's start with Nadia.
Thanks, Raisa. I think I might not be answering the question precisely. I'm thinking a bit more broadly. And this is a bit of a tricky question to answer, I feel, not because there aren't a lot of examples. I think it's because there are so many. And, part of it is trying to figure out how, a lot of them give me hope. It's the translating that hope into something that feels effective and feasible, right? I think where a lot of us struggle, the implementation bit of it, right? But I think the crux of it essentially is that what these more grassroots movements, this transformative justice work really tells me really is that if we're only responding after harm occurs without transforming the root conditions, we really can't be achieving substantive equality, right? Which is one of the principles of CEDAW. And the feminist analysis being produced by this movement is really critical because they're emphasizing, it may seem basic to some of us, but it's really emphasizing that violence is not the product of bad individuals, which is the kind of driver behind the carceral mindset, I feel, where people feel that there are people who are innately evil, for example, and we can pin social ills on them and get rid of them, then everything is fine. But obviously, all these things are shaped by structural conditions and systems of power. So as we're seeing this rise in authoritarianism, criminalization of dissent, shrinking civic space, we're really witnessing governments expanding police powers while feminist organizations and movements are being asked to do more with fewer resources, right? So how do we push back against these punitive logics becoming normalized not only in state systems, but also within social movements and institutions themselves? So for me, these movements, what I get from them is really, they're giving us really material and practical ways to think about it, right? Really essentially driving home the very simple point in our advocacy that safety is not just the absence of violence. It means access to housing, healthcare, education, bodily autonomy, community belonging, political freedom, all these things. So our role here, I think, in our advocacy, our movement work, our engagement with CEDAW and states, is to ensure that governments and states don't get away with kind of acting as though prevention and accountability is somehow separable or disparate from social, economic, and social and economic justice. If someone can't leave an abusive relationship or a harmful workplace because they lack housing, income, if they're worried about the immigration status, they don't have access to childcare, criminalization alone is not going to make them safe. Material deprivation is a key driver of violence, and so prevention requires us to prioritize in our advocacy with our governments to be very specific in what we're investing in. Things like, social protection, living wages, disability access, community-based support systems. No matter what states try to get away with, these are not separate from violence prevention. They are violence prevention. So we have to be able to push them to invest directly and sustainably in this. The things we need to push for example, are, I would say, long-term and flexible funding, because people need resources, for example, for experimentation as well, to see how to model these transformative justice work in their own context, provide political education. I think documentation and evidence building is really key around carceral approaches, so that we can build this sort of cross-movement solidarity. So very quickly, I think I'll just try to say that for IWRAW Asia Pacific, I think the conversation is about transformation, how we build societies that are really grounded in dignity, equality, autonomy, and how we address really the structural conditions that enable violence. Feminist movements have and are continuing to lay a lot of this groundwork. And the challenge really is whether institutions and donors and states are willing to resource and support these transformative visions of justice. Thanks, Raisa.
Thanks so much, Anadia. I'm just going to say social justice provisions are violence prevention. And then move on to Mamello.
All right. So Athena works across Eastern, Southern, and Western Africa. So I have tried to, or I found an example from each region of interventions that are being implemented. So Sonke Gender Justice in South Africa use community action teams, men's dialogues, and survivor-centered support networks to prevent GBV at community level. These initiatives focus on transforming harmful masculinities, training community members, and creating local possibility processes, local accountability processes, rather than relying solely on arrests or imprisonment. Survivors are supported through counseling, mediation, and safety planning, while communities are encouraged to take collective action or collective responsibility for preventing violence. In Kenya, the judiciary-supported alternative justice systems policy recognizes community-based and restorative forms of justice alongside formal courts. So the mechanisms they use are they partner with elders, local mediators, women leaders, and dialogue processes to resolve disputes and address harm in culturally grounded ways. And feminist advocates have pushed for safeguards to ensure that women's rights and survivor autonomy remain central. And when survivor-centered and rights-based, these processes can create accountability, restitution, and social repair without reproducing harm. In Nigeria, Feminist and grassroots organizations have developed community-led responses combined with survivor support, mediation, economic empowerment, and public education. Groups like the Women Advocates for Research and Documentation Center work with local women leaders, faith communities, and youth networks to prevent violence and support survivors outside of purely punitive frameworks. And these interventions often include safe spaces, trauma support, legal accompaniment, and community education that's aimed at changing social norms and normalize violence, or social norms that normalize violence. So two things that are we need, or two interventions that could be successful in partnership with the state, is for economic justice to be treated as gender-based violence prevention. And many survivors remain trapped in violent situations because of poverty, unemployment, and economic dependence. So feminist responses must include land rights, economic support, care work recognition, and economic opportunities. And then economic, yeah, which fuel economic autonomy. And then investment, we need more investment in adolescent and youth political education. So preventing GBV requires early intervention. Schools, youth clubs, and community spaces need feminist, age-appropriate education on consent, bodily autonomy, healthy relationships, sexuality, and digital safety. Young people should be supported, not just as beneficiaries, but also as leaders in violence prevention work. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mamello, and thank you for giving us some solid examples from the region, and also for highlighting economic justice and the importance of political education. I'm going to move to Bing now.
Thank you, Raisa. Yeah, so at IPPF, well, generally we know GVV is a complex and evolving issue that is impacting all communities at personal and structural levels, that we know this. And currently we see an expansion of high-tech, that technology facilitated GVV and online misogyny, with perpetrators directly targeting women and marginalized communities, and now with impunity. So here at IPPF, we believe, just like everyone here and in this space right now, we believe that we need to address the root causes of hate and GVV. We wanted, and we are ensuring that we're working together with communities as well as with men and boys to end all forms of violence. And I think the critical element at IPPF's work in this is that we have has been our journey towards supporting and I'm highlighting our work with the sex workers' rights and partnering with sex workers communities. Violence against sex workers is emblematic of wider violence against women and gender diverse people. That's that has been emblematic, and we know that perpetrators target sex workers because it is unlikely that sex workers will report to authorities, and also not mentioning that in many countries, state forces, police, the military are the first perpetrators of violence against sex workers. So in this context, in terms of how are we, what are we investing on, and what are the things that we are highlighting in terms of the practices. So IPPF launched the Sex Work Consortium, an inclusive of member associations, like consortium of member associations in Thailand, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Colombia, and Paraguay. And this consortium works to ensure that service providers work with local sex workers and redistribute resources and power to these communities that we are working with. The consortium members have collaborated in addressing the root cause of vulnerability, including addressing economic precarity, punitive laws, and policies, or ensure that sex workers are meaningfully included in the dialogue, in the programming, and policy development. And so that gives us hope. So we know that hope that the communities are already there. They're at the forefront and have long been modeled solutions. And as Mamello has already mentioned, they are modeling solutions in terms of harm reduction, community-led health services, peer education, and restorative justice. And so just how we all this is, like this kind of hope is also that we are clinging on for the success of the sex work consortium to be transformative, and not only for the direct partner of the consortium, but also for the federation as a whole, and for the global feminist and reproductive justice movement. If we will see and we will try to support and invest in the consortium to be able to see that whole transformation that would impact us, the global feminist and reproductive justice movements embrace into the sex work initiatives, sex worker-led initiatives. And so that also means that only by breaking walls and addressing our own biases and prejudices that we can together create a more equal and less punitive society. And so this is really important, as we are coming together within this campaign, that kind of, breaking our own biases and prejudices, that us as a movement, as feminists, that we can really move forward and ensuring that we are supporting a community of care, and we are really working towards restorative justice. Yeah, thanks, Raisa.
Thanks so much, Bing. And we're really trying to we're hoping that this campaign is also a space for reflection and rethinking together, right, for all of us as feminist activists. So thank you for highlighting that. Jessica, over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. I feel like I had some notes and I just have to throw them all out and freestyle because we're saying all the same things, I am with really brilliant panelists, and I think what was the question? Like, what should we be investing in? What gives me more hope? It's you, like that we are able to talk, and that I'm like, yes, Bing, yes, Mamello, yes, Nadia, this is really fueling me. I think sometimes we go back to our lives as individuals or in communities where often we don't have this kind of ability to have these conversations. We might have a few people that we can go deep with, but on the day to day, it's complicated. So, okay, I'm going to close this. So I have a big page of notes. So I want to focus on like what we need to invest in and what we need to build. And just riffing off what you've been saying, I was really thinking about mutual aid and community support, and how we can create practical, like these exist, but like what if it's actually kind of difficult to find examples. They don't come easily. And so we know that like many of these methodologies for transformative change, they exist in indigenous communities for like decades, right? And so how can we create a library, a repository, so other people can understand them, and of tools and alternatives that are easy with a feminist lens, and different entry points that are culturally sensitive and can work in different contexts. Also, to create spaces for us to have these really difficult conversations. Um, you know, these will not be easy conversations for many folks. We don't see like people who have experienced a lot of hurt in GBV, and um, it's hard not to be angry. But from my personal experience and experiences of those who have been engaged in legal systems, I don't I don't think I know anyone that it's worked for. In fact, it makes life incredibly more difficult and leaves people open, vulnerable, raw. Um, I really love the comments about preventative measures. Mamello, you were talking about how we work with adolescents and youth at an earlier stage. Nadia, you were talking about basically social determinants, education, housing. I remember this campaign before, like housing is prevention, you know? Like it's like um and definitely housing is violence prevention, as you said. We need to be able to create those spaces to talk about these difficult fault lines. And I'm really hoping that through this campaign, we can, I don't know what it can look like, but we have to go deeper than like 1 or 2 hour webinars. We have to be uncomfortable in these spaces. Um, I'm really inspired by learning about often at AWID, we have these solidarity spaces quarterly where they're basically town hall sessions. And I'm bringing them up because I think that these could be places and have been places where people can share different methodologies that they're using. Yesterday, someone came, a Kenyan feminist, and was talking about community accountability and monitoring that was happening in her community around SRHR and GBV. And I think this is how we learn. It might not always be the entirety of a solution, like a project or a methodology will be the solution, but parts of it can work. So, yeah, once again, thank you everyone for all of your comments.
Thanks, Jessica. Thank you for leading us through the how to figure this out. And I'm just going to move to Susanna.
Thanks. I think, like Jessica, I've thrown out my notes. I wanted to actually start not yet with hope, but with gratitude. So I have enormous gratitude for the other panelists here. I agree that the comments have been really they've been precise and thoughtful and very specific, and I'm really grateful for that. I also took a look at um, who the participants are, and I have to send out enormous gratitude. I see that many of you are people from whom I have learned, and I'm grateful for you being here and grateful for our collective ability to have this conversation. I wanted to just say a couple of additional things. One is there are things that give us hope, even in this really difficult time. There was the recent decision in Kenya to decriminalize consensual adolescent sexuality. Like that's huge, and I think those we really need to celebrate when those things happen because they are not what's common in this moment of rising authoritarianism and regressive action by states. So, it's really, we need to share that information. We need to celebrate that. I think that's super important. I'm given hope by the many conversations we've had with folks that are about alternatives. I remember a conversation not long ago with a colleague who does transformative justice work in India around gender-based violence, and they talked about doing a training with a lot of feminist and GBV organizations where the organizations were asking them, so what are the alternatives? And they kind of turned it around and said to them, well, what are you doing? because you're not mostly engaging with the criminal legal system. And, one of the things they said to me about that conversation was every single one of those organizations engages in alternatives to criminalization, and they're extremely varied, and they're often very context specific and not necessarily specifically replicable, but ideas that, if and when we can share them, can really be inspirational and helpful. And that takes me to Jessica's comment about the need for places to share this information. So one of the things we hope to be able to do, and it's all, as everybody here, funding permitting, is to create that kind of living database of alternatives. Because I think it's true that there are many different ways that organizations, community-led organizations especially, are engaging in alternatives to criminalization around gender-based violence, but also more broadly. But we only share that when we're in conversation with each other and in the kind of rare instances where we can be part of some broader conversation. So it is one of our hopes is to be able to create that kind of repository of examples, and to do that in some way that also creates a space for more conversation. The last thing that I want to say is that I hope we can also use the conversation about challenging criminalization of gender-based violence to also challenge the effort to narrow our understanding of gender. And that's happening in far too many places, in far too I don't know, deceptive ways. But we really need to use this conversation as a way to say, it's really important for us to be explicit about having a broad and fluid and relational understanding of gender. We need to be very clear that those who are harmed by gender-based violence aren't just women and aren't just women and trans women. It's very, every single person can experience gender-based violence, and we need responses that can really grapple with that, or that are really done in consideration of that. And so these conversations give me hope. The conversations that we've had as we've created the campaign have given me an enormous amount of hope about what are the alternatives. There's a huge amount of interest in this conversation, and that is tremendously hopeful. So I am filled with both hope and gratitude. Over.
Thank you so much, Susanna. And thank you to all the panelists for raising some really interesting points, both in terms of why they're engaging with this campaign and what those hopeful alternatives are, or where we need to really be focusing on. We have more comments than questions here, so I'm just going to misuse my power as moderator here and ask a question from my end, and then go to the one question that we have in the Q&A. I just, both Susanna and Jessica spoke about feminist fault lines. However, all of you come from organizations that have, are parts of large movements, like you are associated with many, many organizations and across the world. And there seems to be a lot of evidence, and there seems to be a lot of agreement even in our comment section about the harms of criminal responses. So in that context, what are some of the how are we dealing with these fault lines? Like, this campaign is one of those examples, but what are some of the other examples where we're dealing with these fault lines at the community level, or in one of the multilateral spaces, and so on? I think this is really an area of interest, because even when we were designing this campaign, every time we spoke to someone, they would strongly agree with us and then bring up this concern around fault lines. So I think it's also important to talk about how are we dealing with this, and or are we not dealing with this, etc. So this is free for all. Whoever wants to respond to it first, go ahead.
I'll go. Yeah, no, Raisa, when we first actually had a conversation with Susanna around this campaign, exactly this conversation about fault lines also went in. And just so because we have been working within this whole context of, as feminists, we are angry. We have this collective anger, and that collective anger of violence has been so entrenched on us for several years that has been, like as feminists, we are guarding our spaces of that collective anger that we should be doing some collective action also. And that resulted to having a lot more of policies and laws around violence against women and protection of women. And I'm saying here women, as you know, as has been always been the context when we talk about violence, specifically, in the recent past, since the 90s until now. And we know evidence also really show that it has been women has been targeted, and there's patriarchy. We know the context. But how are we going to deal with this fault line? Exactly why we need to have this conversation of collective care. That whole collective care and that whole reflection, and also confronting our own thoughts and biases around this. We have been, as feminists, also, just like how patriarchy shaped men to be perpetrators of violence, we have also been shaped as feminists to, push back and design programs to incarcerate people that are, perpetrating violence. And so hence that whole conversation needs to happen within us, and within us, and also bringing others in the conversation. And I do agree that it wouldn't be easy, just like how it wasn't also easy in the past when we were talking about sex and gender, right? In the 90s. And we have transformed as movements and as feminists. So I think it's a challenge more than actually there's like magic solution at this point. It's really is posing a challenge to every one of us working on this topic. I'll stop there. Thanks, Rice.
Feel free to unmute and add if you want to any of the others.
Just to add one piece to what Bing just said, and thank you for that. I think we need to talk a lot about what we mean when we say about accountability, right? Because accountability is really different from punishment. And we can narrowly define accountability as punishment, or we can think about what does accountability mean in the context of creating safe relationships, safe communities, safe societies. And we tend to understand accountability in relatively narrow ways in an official sense, even if I think many of us in our own lives would come up with a very different answer about what does accountability mean, what does responsibility mean. So for me, it's really important that we take that more personal, if you will, conversation about accountability and raise that to a public conversation so we can really talk about what is feminist accountability, what is human rights accountability in the real world. And that is not to say, I'm looking at you, Nadia, that is not to say that the human rights norms and institutions that we have don't need to be supported and sustained. But I think, though, that what we mean and what we mean by accountability and what are the mechanisms of accountability that work and that we might choose. What are those? And how do we then work back and forth between that kind of understanding of accountability, our own communities, our own criminal legal systems, and existing institutions of human rights accountability?
Thank you. Before anyone else responds, I also just wanted to add to the existing question a point around, how do you think the anti-gender movement kind of adds to this fissure of fault line that exists within the feminist movement? And one of the questions that came up is that, isn't this a question of criminal law broadly, more broadly than just a fault line within the feminist movement? So if anyone wants to respond to that.
I can take some of it. Thanks. I think there is something about it, like how do we, I do think it's broader around criminalization in general, right? Like, and then the question will always come up, like, how do we deal with folks who do harm in our societies? Like, what do we do? But you know, violence breeds violence. It perpetuates it, it continues it within our societies. There are different ways to navigate systems, as we've discussed. And I think that when it comes to this piece about when I think about criminal law, I think about different movements around defunding the police, as well, that also tie into it, right? And I think, in some of my conversations, as Bing was saying, with some other feminists, like, I think about like consent laws where feminists for a long time have really tried to get certain language in books. And but the repercussions of language, for instance, for people living with HIV, Claudia had a comment about it, so I'm going to touch on that, have been awful, right? It targets certain members of communities, and feminists weren't looking at like they don't at the time around certain consent laws, like they weren't looking at the impacts of how it would impact women living with HIV. And so what's actually happened is there's these awful laws that exist on the books that do so much harm in our societies, that I think if we could go back, maybe we would change them. But I think there's a lot of fear when talking about fault lines of even opening those conversations because we don't want to lose any of the potential ground that we have made. Yeah.
Thank you. Again, just adding one more layer to this, because Arushi's raised a question here saying, so how do we engage with, moving a little further from the feminist fault lines, how do we engage with other organizations that work on GBV and violence against women who might not strategically or principally be feminist organizations? And someone else also really raised a good question about what does decolonial approaches look like when we live under so many colonial institutions. And I think these two go together because that's really what we're using, so many women's rights organizations are using to respond to the situation, right? Yeah, this is a really good gig for me. I just have to ask the questions. I have to say, this is amazing.
I'll answer. I didn't hear the first one properly, but the part about us living within decolonial systems and what it means to have decolonial responses. And initially, when I was thinking about the questions that were sent about for the webinar, I was thinking, okay, what did I don't know what other word to use besides policing, because there's nothing, everything about policing is violent, right? But just think about like organizing around keeping order in pre-colonial times, um, out romanticizing pre-colonial times, because that often happens when we think of it as some utopia, but like through whose eyes and narratives do we think about pre-colonial times, right? But some of the things that I thought of was redistributing power and resources to grassroots communities and organizations that that serve and work in partnerships with marginalized community. And then thinking about, because there are people, who have some indigenous knowledge and community-based practices, but speaking to them about what healing, what mediation and accountability look like, where that are survivor-centered and rights-based. So also questioning punishment as the default response instead of investing in prevention, care, restoration, and collective responsibility. Yeah. And then also a big one is challenging donor and institutional power, which means that we redefine expertise on what punishment looks like, and who receives funding and who gets to make decisions. Um, and yeah, and then also holding space for contradictions openly, realizing that some activists may still need to use courts and state systems for protection while simultaneously also trying to like destable or unsettle colonial ways of punishment. So embrace the contradictions.
Yeah. It's also about decolonizing how we function. So, yeah, I mean,
Yes.
thank you. Thank you for responding. But Susanna, sorry, you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
I just wanted to quickly respond to Livio's question. Hi, Livio. Thank you for answering the question. And Livio makes me think that there was a comment earlier about the March 8th principles that are incredibly useful for this, that the International Commission of Jurists put out. So please go to that as a reference, because I think it's actually a kind of answer to the question that it is indeed broader. I was thinking being about the conversation you and I had kind of at the beginning of this about how important it is that we use the conversation about challenging criminalization of gender-based violence as a springboard to talking about challenging criminalization itself and the ways in which that the punitivism that we so easily accept is part of what we need to be talking about. So thank you for raising that. And yes, absolutely, it is broader. And we need to make it broader, but we also need to talk within our own communities. And I think it goes a little bit to Arushi's question that we do need to talk about within our own communities where there's trust about what's wrong with this thing that we have all been advocating for 30, 40, 50 years. So that's the specificity about GBV, and as well as GBV as an important way of raising broader questions about criminalization.
Sorry.
Please go ahead, Bengal.
Yes, no, I just want to have a little follow-up, very, very short, because I know Nadia is also going to come in. But yeah, totally. I think one of the things that we also need to tackle as as this campaign moves on is that in a broader sense, we really need to have that broader conversation around the whole justice system and how it is colonial in many contexts in the world, how it is colonial and how it is dysfunctional, and yet many people are still relying into getting justice out of that kind of system that we have. So yes, I totally agree that this goes beyond the conversation on GBV. Thanks.
Nadia, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, sorry. I was actually just going to respond to Arushi's question really about how we engage outside of our with people who might not share our strategy and principles. And just to share, like with IWRAW Asia Pacific, because we coordinate engagement with CEDAW and the constructive dialogues in Geneva, we often have to wear two hats, right? One, we think about it as our political hat, with our political positioning, and then our facilitator hat, where we engage with a wide range of organizations that may or may not align with our own principles. So I think something really key is to have really strong internal understanding and alignment with what your principles are, whether that's organizationally or individually or however you're working right within the movement, and bringing that into the spaces that you're in. We think of it as conscientizing work, where we may have an organization that is, say, pushing the Nordic model or that's completely anti-sex work in the same room as the sex worker activists that we support. We curate a space that's safe and protective and open for conversation, because it is about facilitating this. It's about putting, without sounding too patronizing, it's about putting a human face on the people that what you're advocating for is affecting. So I think for me, keeping those lines of communication open, and I know that's not possible or desirable for everyone, but an organization like ours, which is in the position to take this on, I think that's really key to hold fast to our own principles about certain things, but making sure that the people that we come up against when they disagree or they have a different point of view, that we're able to engage with them both on an intellectual level, but also on a social and emotional level.
I think that's a really good point for us to stop this conversation at for now, but this is just the beginning of the conversations that this campaign will be engaging with. I want to firstly thank all of our panelists. I know that this was difficult for some of us, but you guys brought in such rich conversation. Thank you so much for giving us an introduction to what the Justice Beyond Jails campaign will look like. And thank you everyone who was listening in for your interest, for engaging in the comments. Please follow us. Up on your screen is some of the stuff that we've already put out. So there is an introductory blog that's out. There are 2 podcast episodes that are out. And Tehani, can you go to the next slide? And of course, there is the tool. A lot of the examples that you heard today that our panelists spoke about you will see those reflected in the stories on the tool. And maybe that's a good way or a good introductory conversation for within the feminist spaces as well as outside to sort of start talking about what is challenging and why we should be thinking beyond criminal responses to GBV. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. We will be sending out more information about the campaign. We will be sharing the recording of this conversation as well. And thank you for engaging with us so deeply. Please follow us on the socials. And yeah, this is how you can engage. We will send this out on email as well. Thanks, everyone, and have a good night, a good day, depending on where you are. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Raisa. Thank you, Susanna.
Thank you.